My name's Chris Risher. I'm going to be the moderator, if you will, for the webinar today. I lead our advisory services here at RedHelm, formerly One Path and Ideal Integrations. For those that are new to our journey, we've also got a few other team members and a partner together. I want to go ahead and start our introductions, and then we'll step through what our agenda is going to be for today around access management, and maybe start with a little compelling risk statement about poor access management. But with that, I'd like to pass it over to Matt. You mind doing a little introduction? Then we'll go to Eric, and then finally to Jake.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Hansberry. I am a fractional CXO at RedHelm, and I get the pleasure of working with Chris Risher on a nearly daily basis.
Eric?
Good afternoon. My name's Eric Wright. I'm a shareholder at Schneider Downs, which is a large regional CPA firm with a significant concentration in IT risk and IT auditing. Jake?
Yeah, great to be here. Jacob Katz, I've been with Schneider Downs for about 7 years. Really excited to be here, mostly focused in SOC reporting, really any governance framework, compliance framework. So excited to talk about HR provisioning.
Good. All right. Well, one thing I wanted to start with is some of the risks around poor access management and defining roles that need access to different applications. One concern that we always have, especially from a compliance standpoint, as we're evaluating clients, is does the person have the right access to the right applications or right workloads specifically within the application? We see a lot of crossing over, and a lot of tickets that we end up getting are recurring tickets, not just from is the end user frustrated, not just from that perspective, but do they end up getting the right access at the end of the day? So a lot of today's discussion is going to touch on those topics. You guys want to state anything that's at the start to add to those comments?
I would say ditto. In the world of compliance and auditing, we see a lot of concern around who's got access to what.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to actually start today with a poll, get everyone engaged really early. John, you mind posting the poll up really fast? And it's, how would you describe your organization's current approach to mapping job roles to the applications and workloads people need to do their job? So this might be a little bit surprising. We're not starting with automation. We're not starting with how do you do this thing called automatic provisioning of applications. We're actually starting with how have you gone about mapping job roles to what applications and workloads those job roles should have. So we'll give everyone maybe a minute or two to answer, and then we'll kind of evaluate what the response is. John, are we getting some good. I'm seeing that a little over half of the responses already in. Good. While we're waiting on that, I would like to see, I'd like to move on to our first section where we're going to talk about building the foundation, and that is about job role definition. And my first question, Eric, how does your organization evaluate companies' job definitions and documentation of roles and jobs? How does this impact compliance? And I think you kind of started with that during our introduction.
Sure. Yeah. So if you think about it, industry best practices are around what I would call least privilege. And I don't know how you do least privileges if you don't have job roles established and defined. So, you think about it, have they been defined? Are they consistently applied across the entire organization? Are they reviewed on a periodic basis? are there certifications or degrees or special skills that are required to hold those, and are those defined in those job descriptions? And then the idea is, and you then take the roles that are there and you make sure that when you provide people access to systems, it's commensurate with their job responsibilities. And then in order to maintain that, there's a control in place that you would sit back and look at on a periodic basis, whether it's semi-month or semi-annually or manually, where you do assess the access that people have to make sure that it's still commensurate with the responsibilities that they have as in the organization.
Matt,
So,
where would you say that the gaps typically lie with what Eric just talked about when we're doing our evaluations?
In terms of gaps, I think, Chris, we see a few things. We see stakeholder engagement is one of the hardest things to get moving. You can have the greatest IT organization in the world that has everything automated and understood from soup to nuts, but if the other folks aren't engaged and empowered, it's going to be a struggle regardless. Even if you can get it right the first time, if they're not engaged, if the business managers, if the department heads, if HR are not engaged, it's going to become very difficult for that it's probably difficult to get it right in the first place, and increasingly difficult to keep it correct and up to date over time. So again, generally, this is one of those things where keeping it simple is a very good idea.
Yeah, and I kind of resonate with the end of that statement about engaging stakeholders and then keeping up with it. Because Eric talked about ensuring that not only do we align those job roles and definitions to what they need access to, but actually updating that on a periodic term basis and reviewing what access they have at that moment. Jake, when you're working with clients, where have you seen HR and IT alignment gaps in role definition, and how did those organizations address them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, something that I've seen pretty commonly, job titles don't equal system roles. And whenever HR and IT work in silos, that's where you get excessive privileges, inappropriate access, shadow processes. Um, just an example I can give, from HR's perspective, the system engineer to them, is a system engineer. They don't know if it's front end access, back end access, and if they're provisioning access for a system engineer based off their assumption of what they think that role may have, that right there's excessive privileges and it's just inappropriate access. From IT, they need to be involved so that HR can understand what specific level of access is to be granted based off of job titles, and really create a matrix or defined set of roles that are assigned based off job titles, just so you can really enforce that least privilege, and avoid any shadow processes. Individual's manager reaching out directly to IT to request one system privilege or one access to a system that maybe another system engineer doesn't have. It gets pretty hairy quickly. And really, to look at this more holistically, HR and IT really needs to have periodic check-ins and really strategic alignment.
Yeah. I know as a technologist, and we started out here with defining process, defining roles and what roles need access to what applications. So we're defining a process to some degree, whether it's, we're not talking about workflow automation. We're talking about giving people access automation to their relevant applications and what pieces of that application they need access to. So we're stepping back and evaluating what those roles need access to do their job. When IT steps into something with business, we have a tendency to jump to a solution versus, hey, let's actually map this out. And I've seen with clients when they go through this exercise, or with customers when they go through this exercise, that they may actually change the definition of a job based on what they find this individual that they're studying to map this stuff out, they may change the job definition. Have you ever come across that, Jake, when you're working with clients?
Yeah, I mean, you can't set it and forget it, and I just go back to Eric's point about a semi-annual or annual review on what access is actually being provisioned. Individuals' job descriptions change, especially for small organizations. And as an organization grows, I mean, again, if there's not that alignment and review of standard access provision, then you'll have people out there just with excessive access.
Yeah. And that kind of segues really well into, hey, Matt, what are some consequences that can arise from misclassifying roles before you start working on any kind of automation?
Well, it's going to be very difficult, right? So if you're not able to effectively map out those roles and have that built ahead of time, you are going to be scrambling from behind. That upfront work is what defines how IT can work with those stakeholders so that this is done effectively. And so, to your point, if it's not done upfront, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep it up to date, and it's increasingly difficult to actually have any idea what's going on. And so you get into all the sort of downsides of not doing this very well. You're at risk for unpleasant onboarding experiences. You're at risk for difficulty for broad access changes. If you make organizational wide changes and you decide this level of person requires a different level of access, now you're going and it's really hard to identify who has those things. Whereas if you've done it up front, you're in a much better position to make that happen. And I think finally, from a security perspective, and this is one of the things that I think kind of is undersold sometimes, it is one of your biggest risks whenever throughout an organization is when you have a termination event with somebody. And if you don't do this really well, it becomes very difficult for you to close that gap, which is the time where you're at a lot of risk for naughty behavior. And a lot of times it goes great, but for that 1% or 2% times where it goes badly, you want to make sure that that window is really tight, and a good job of this whole process will make that very easy for you.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of companies are still working on connecting all their applications into SSO. I know that, that's a journey. Security is always a journey. And before we move on to other spaces, I know that that's going to be something we talk about a little later today, is what are the different steps that you might look at when considering an automation strategy. I know that, Matt, that's something you want to speak to. Before we move on, I do want to kind of circle back to the poll results, just so we can consider what that's looking like. John, you mind posting the results for us? All right. How would you describe? You haven't started yet? Okay, that makes sense. All right, so it sounds like we've kind of got a broad spectrum of where everyone is. I'm curious. I saw that one person responded with not sure. I would be curious to see if we're not sure about what the process looks like for mapping job roles. Maybe circle back to us offline if you're uncomfortable with maybe posting what you were thinking when you responded with not sure. Happy to talk about that live. So those are good to see. We've got a few people that have done some basic mapping, but it is a journey more so than a destination. Matt, I wanted to come back to you to talk about what strategies can help keep an organization's role to application mapping up to date. Because Eric started the whole discussion about that is a periodic check-in has to occur so it stays up to date. What are some strategies that business managers can consider to make sure that they're involved in the process and continually updating mappings?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I mean, there's a few things we need to start with, right? The first thing in my mind is documentation. So all this has to be clearly documented, clearly understood. All the business managers need to understand what their roles and responsibilities are throughout this process. If you don't have that, it's going to be very difficult to make sure that you're doing those periodic reviews. The other, and this ties into compliance, right? So we've talked about compliance a little bit. This is the sort of thing that compliance frameworks are going to ask you. Do you do a periodic review? And you're going to have documentation and policy that says you do that, and then you're going to have to be able to show that you do it. And so having a handle on how to, and it's not just limited to identity automation, although that's what we're talking about today. It's really part of a bigger project, which is sort of this periodic task monitoring and documentation effort. And so if you're good at that, this fits really naturally into those periodic tasks, whether it's quarterly, whether it's yearly, whether it's monthly, whether it's weekly. Getting a good handle on those events, who's responsible and how they're documented, is going to lead you to a place where you're forced to go ahead and account for these things, and that's going to lead to a much better job of periodically reviewing these roles and making sure that the access is still appropriate for the folks in the organization.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think that this is a good moment to show what an exercise might look like. Here at OnePath, we have stepped clients through understanding job roles. You might be like, wait a second, you're an IT company, you are technology forward. Well, we also want to set up our clients for success when it comes to business forward operations. So this is what an exercise for role-based access control, like evaluating the process. We have different roles. Hang on one second. I'll actually bring up I think I've got a laser pointer in here somewhere. Well, we've got a pencil. So, spotlight, there it is. All right, so we've got our individual roles, whether that's a manager, and we have what effectively is vertical and horizontal placement within the organization. And that could be management class. Are they a manager? Are they an individual contributor? What their department is. Is there a special department they're a part of within business operations? What's their geographic location? That might be important information depending on what kind of industry you're in. Then we're looking at workloads, applications based on workloads, and then specific features. And then the downstream effects of what are those workloads. You might be like, well, this doesn't mean a whole lot to me. So let's move on to the next slide. And this is a practical example of that. We have an accounts payable manager. Sorry, my spotlight went away. We have an accounts payable manager. Obviously, they are part of the vertical management apparatus. They're vertically aligned. They're part of finance, specifically accounts payable. And then we start tracking that role to specific workload types that are within one or multiple applications. You could have multiple ERPs if you're going through an integration between two different companies, one acquiring the other. And then you're specifically within features and functions inside those applications. If it's an accounts payable manager, that person may only need the AP module, but they might need to be tracking AP balance by specialist. So this is a practical example of mapping your roles to their individual workloads. Jake and Eric, can you share an example where inaccurate mapping caused access or compliance issues for your clients?
Yeah, and Jake, I'll step in, and Chris, I'm going to feed off of your accounts payable example there.
Oh, perfect.
We always use the term 3 strikes and you're out. So think about in the AP function, if I got the ability to set up a vendor, I've got the ability to approve invoices, and I've got the ability to approve wires and checks. That's 3 strikes. One of those functions need to go away because you've got improper segregation of duties. And we've seen in smaller companies and even in larger companies where I will say those 3 strikes exist, and all of a sudden you've got an individual that's perpetrated a fraud against the organization. And those are things that no organization actually wants to go through. If you are a publicly traded company and you've got to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley or the SOX framework, those are the things your external auditors and your internal audit, quite frankly, should come in and should be looking at to make sure that there, quote, are no three strikes in your business processes to, in essence, commit a fraud against the organization or a misappropriation of funds or a misstatement of the financial statements. On the IT side, we always look at the developer role. Do our developers have access to production? If they do, that means untested code has the possibility of being migrated and being used in the public environment. And that's, I go back to my MIS classes years and years and years ago, and that was just MIS 101. Developers don't have access to production or even test for that matter. So we've seen, over the years, a number of organizations, I'll just say, ignore the idea that they need compensating controls when they have segregation of duties issues. And they've given folks excessive access without the compensating control, the monitoring controls that you'd want to put in place. And there have been frauds. We've seen money, fraudulently taken, assets being inappropriately used, and we've also seen misstatement of financial statements through inappropriate roles.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add on to that, the three strikes are out example you gave, Eric, you spoke about internal fraud, but another point that I want to highlight is also if that user's credentials are exposed and there's a threat actor who gets access to this account, who can perform highly privileged actions, right there, you're looking at a significant security incident at your organization. And one point that I was going to make is spear phishing, right? Like I was going to give the example of C-suite level executives having access to systems or roles that maybe they don't use on a day-to-day basis. And the first instinct is someone may think at first, the co-founder or the CEO or the COO, why wouldn't they have access to everything? And you have to take a step back and understand if it's not something that's being used for their job description or their job role or something that's on a day-to-day basis, it really increases the surface area for a pretty significant security incident. And then just on the other point you made, Eric, about companies not wanting to implement compensating controls when there's SOD issues, of course you always want to implement a compensating control if there is an SOD issue. But I also like take a step back and look at it from the perspective of defense in depth. Don't just accept, okay, we need to implement a review of access on a quarterly basis because there's an SOD issue. Really take a step back and push yourself to understand what is that really needed, right? Or are we just kind of hanging on to something that doesn't need to be? Change is difficult to accept, and I can say firsthand, working with many different clients in different frameworks or compliance situations. No one wants to be told that their access is inappropriate or that it needs to be removed. That can be a difficult conversation to have, but I think it's one that everyone needs to challenge themselves and their organizations to have.
I think there was an interesting comment that you made in there that triggered something in my brain. Is there is a challenge culturally within an organization, because you talked about the CEO having too much access, because that potentially exposes you to spear phishing. And if the CEO gets a lot of emails, he or she might click a URL they shouldn't and follow through with it, thinking about something else. And then all of a sudden they're a global admin because at some point they ask for that access. And you have to have a good culture of challenging regardless of title, saying, let's think about that for a moment. When you request that, let me tell you a scenario that could play out with you having access to everything. It exposes us in these ways. So like having a culture that accepts dissenting respectfully and making sure that everyone is capable and empowered to hold the best for the organization.
Yeah,
Do you guys ever
absolutely.
come across evaluating that part of organizations?
We
I
come
kind of put you
across
on the
it.
spot there.
No,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
it's a great question. I mean,
question. Yeah.
it's in some regard. I mean, just thinking again about, C-suite level executives, you know, we come in and we can't make the assumption that access is inappropriate. So our first step is to say, why do you have this access? And it's a very similar process to how you were explaining of how you're actually developing for HR automation and role automation. You're taking a step back to look at the process and understand why that is actually needed. And in some cases, there's a legitimate business reason, but in others, it's, you know, why wouldn't I have that access? And it puts us in the situation to say, write either a process improvement or in sometimes exceptions within their report. And at the end of the day, we want to be partners with all of our clients and really lead them to the water to make decisions and have a culture that allows them to have these conversations. So we do have these conversations usually in closing meetings with our clients, and um, sometimes they take our advice, and other times it's let's look at it next year. So
And
Okay.
I'll say some of the things we do, Chris, real quick, is we'll look at the logs and see how often they use it. And
mhm.
if it's infrequent, we'll try to institute or implement some type of break glass activity that,
Mhm.
okay, break the glass, now you have it, but it's only short-lived and it returns back to regular user.
Yeah. I think that intra ID, obviously we use Microsoft a lot with clients, and having that ability to expire some type of
Mm,
access at some specific point in time, and then they have to request again.
Hmm.
So like, I think utilizing that type of functionality is to the benefit of any, company, especially to continue that culture of, dissenting and constantly looking at who's got access to what so we don't expose ourselves unnecessarily. And I want to transition us actually to talk about automation now, because I know, we've talked about, the business focus a little bit. I definitely want to move into the automation portion of this specifically, because I'm sure we got some HR people on here like, all right, what's in this for me? What I would say is that if we show the technology for a moment, because Matt knows me pretty well at this point, that I definitely do not focus on the technology. But for a moment, we're going to focus on the technology. And how would you do something like this? Once I've done the role mapping and I know what people need access to, what parts of applications they need access to, what's the blocking and tackling of doing something like this? Well, this is an example of a pipeline. There are lots of tools and ways to do this. If you've invested in a different identity platform other than Intra, there are ways to do this. This just happens to be kind of the Microsoft way of doing this. And I'm not going to really step through each portion of this. I will say that if you look at the very front of this pipeline, we have our HIRS platforms. The whole point of something like this is to empower HR, our HR team, to be able to set information about employees, what their role is, what the different attributes that are relevant to that role, and have it pushed all the way into the IT systems and downstream applications relevant to that role. So this is just one example of one we've done with clients. We've done this one a couple of times. And uh, I would say that it definitely is really successful as long as the upfront documentation we've been talking about has been done. And with that, Matt, what are the primary benefits of identity automation and HR-driven provisioning, not just for IT, but for HR and new team members within an organization?
Well, Chris, I think you hit it right there. The biggest, in my mind, the biggest advantage for doing this is what I'll call a smoothness of, sorry, smoothness of entry for new employees. And I know we're talking about automation and we're IT folks and we think, oh, all these cool automations and all this cool technology. But the reality is the biggest benefit you get out of this, candidly, is a very soft, a much softer thing. And that is when a new person enters into your organization, you want that to be frictionless as possible. You want them to think, ideally, they think about IT for 0 seconds, right? They don't even, we should be magic effectively.
They don't want to talk to us in their first week.
They 100% do not, and I don't blame them because I know us, and it's a pain, right? You're in a new organization, and you're focused on what your job is. You're anxious, you're nervous, you're meeting new people. The last thing you want to do is worry about how my password reset and how do I get into this thing and what do I do over here? I don't have access to this system. So to me, that's one of the biggest benefits is we should be able to make it very, very smooth and frictionless as new employees enter, and they should not think about IT. That's sort of the best case scenario. More on the sort of on the technical side, when you do need to make changes, it's a lot easier to make those changes, especially if you have it well documented and you understand how your organization is works. It's going to be a lot simpler when you make a decision to say, oh, these managers no longer have this access because of this really good business reason. And then lastly, and I hit on this earlier, but I think this is a really big one, is from a security perspective, and it goes across the board that we've talked about a few of those things, but one of the biggest risks to an organization from a data perspective tends to be during terminations where things don't go well. Usually unplanned terminations or something like that. If that access to different systems is retained too long, you open up a window for naughty behavior, and we don't want that. So using a really good identity automation should be able to shut it down immediately, such that they simply don't have the opportunity to do anything bad, whether they would have or not.
Gotcha. I think I would like to get some more audience engagement. We're going to press forward straight to our next audience poll. It's actually a two-part question for those that can answer the first one. We will actually have a second question for you, depending on what your answer is for the first one. John, you mind throwing the question up for us, please? Which of the following best describes your organization's current needs regarding compliance gap assessments or certifications? You might ask, well, what does that have to do with this? There are companies, obviously, that go through these gap assessments. That's, Schneider Downs, they help lead certifications. We can help you get into a gap assessment, where if you did like a 2-year compliance certification strategy, you might do a gap assessment in the first year and then actually go for the certification in the second year. So we're curious to see who on this call has a requirement for getting a gap assessment or pursuing a certification. And if you are, we're looking forward to understanding which compliance frameworks, and that's kind of the second question, which compliance frameworks are relevant to you. So I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to answer that. We'll move on to a couple of questions. I want to circle back to Eric. This is routinely called RBAC, role-based access control. So how can RBAC improve your compliance efforts, and where can gaps remain?
Yeah. So first and foremost, the key to setting up roles-based access is you've got to do it right. And if you do it right, here are the benefits of it. It will help you enforce least privileges. It's going to dictate what people have access to, and is it proper based upon their job responsibilities. So again, set up right, that's one of the big benefits. 2, it supports segregation of duties. Again, set up the roles right. You won't have to worry about 3 strikes, you're out. If you do have a 3 strikes, you're out, there should be a red flag that I need some type of monitoring control at the end of it. The other thing that it does is it simplifies the audit readiness. It does a great job of logging people's access, gives as an auditor, gives me the ability to reach in, look, and see exactly what's going on. If we've got an issue, I can look back to see who did what and who logged in and did what based upon the role-based security setup. It improves your identity lifecycle and the governance around that. Think about, not only provisioning users, but terminating users. And, that's going to help streamline those processes and make things a lot better or easier for you um, to enact if you've put this in place. And then last but not least, it enhances your third-party risk management. So if you set up role-based and you've got contractors in your systems, you've got the ability to restrict what they can do based upon the contract they have with you. And you have also the ability at that point in time to I'll use terminate those accounts based upon a time frame or a window in which that contract goes for. And if you don't have those types of tools, you've got to have a pretty good sized to-do list, and you've got to go down that every day and check on it. So those are probably the biggest things that you can do. Gaps, it's still going to take a human to manage this. You've got to make sure you've got it set up right. You still got to look at it on a periodic basis to make sure that those rules and responsibilities align with one another. And that's basically the gaps. It's not the silver bullet to everything, but it certainly helps.
Yeah. And I think that lends itself to something I'm interested in. Matt, how do you ensure your identity automation follows regulatory requirements?
Thanks, Chris. I think I think Eric hit on a lot of these sort of things already, but I want to hit a few bits on that. So one, whenever possible, try to stick with standards. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't go building things just to build them. It may add complexity. It may add challenges. So, if you've got something that again, within the Microsoft platform or whatever platform you use, let's try that first. Let's see if that does the job, and only go to something more complicated when it absolutely is necessary for your business. The other thing I would say is from a documentation standpoint, the better documented the entire process is, and this goes way beyond identity automation, but it certainly applies here. When it comes time to do those audits, for those certifications, for those compliance needs, it can be overwhelming at first, especially if you haven't been through these things before. So when you are presented with this big list of things that you have to go identify and answer, man, it's a lot easier. You don't have to go hunting and figuring things out, especially if all the stuff you're doing is documented well. You don't have to go, hey, did we have that control buried out in my Azure environment that I have to go look up? And what about that one over here that's sitting in my Exchange server? It's already documented, the answer. And then from the verification perspective, you may have to go and provide evidence, and that's going to be another step that would require to go in there and find the implementation. But at least, the policy piece becomes a lot easier.
Gotcha. Yeah. John, can you show us the results from the poll, please? Okay. Oh, perfect. That's some CIS, HIPAA. I guess we probably have a healthcare person on here. ISO, NIST, PCI, a lot of the typical frameworks, which totally makes sense. Happy for RedHelm and Schneider Downs to help anyone with getting assessed, depending on if you're looking to do a certification moving forward. But I think the next place I want to move to.
Hey, Chris, can I just real quick? I just want to pick on one thing. I didn't see anyone say anything about CMMC, and I want to just ask folks if that's an area where they've looked into, because that is one of the newer certifications, and I'm wondering if for anyone doing any sort of defense or government contracting, that becomes relevant very quickly. And I just wonder if folks are aware of that.
And they just released the final rule yesterday in press. So and they're releasing contracts November 1st with a DFAR 7021 clause in it.
Yeah. So just that no one, I mean, it's a small audience, so it's possible that it isn't relevant, but I just I think it's worth just noting for the group that is one that people should be aware of and just take a quick look, especially again, anything government related, no matter how far down the chain, this might become something that you have to care about.
And I didn't mention at the beginning of the webinar, if anyone has comments or wants to respond back, feel free to drop it in the chat. We are monitoring the chat. I did say something in the chat about it, but you're more than welcome to drop something in there and we will address it real time. We also will have Q&A towards the end here. Next thing I wanted to step through is actually KPIs. I think, Matt, you started to hint at some earlier in the webinar. What are the most valuable in tracking automation success? Specifically, for this one, I I think that I want to stick to that around automation success within identity, within RBAC, HR provisioning, new user provisioning specifically. So,
Absolutely. So I think I'm going to once again start with a squishy one because I think there is a disproportionate value in this in a way that not everyone thinks about. So new employee satisfaction. So the real question is like, how do I know my employees are happy as they onboard? Ask them. So that's the first thing is reach out and have a conversation. Your conversation better is still, have an automated survey that goes out and that gives you data to track. That is certainly one of the KPIs, and frankly, the most important one in my mind when it comes to identity automation, because it affects the entire organization and everyone that enters into your organization. On a more hard science side of it, I would say, measure the time from hire, from hire to full access. How long does it take you to do the full access control, get everyone new into the organization, all the access that they need? Measure it. That's one. Ticket volume, when it comes to, especially if you're able to disambiguate between general tickets or other tickets and those that are for access control specifically, you should be able to measure how much of that you're seeing, and it should go down as you get better at understanding your organization and implementing different features across the sort of identity automation space. And I'd say lastly, this one is not harder to track, but I think it's worth calling out, especially if you're doing multiple compliance sort of things or you're doing them repeatedly, is how many findings are you getting? Do you find that it's easier and you're doing a better job of those compliance and audits? Because if you do this right, along with other things, you should see that those gaps become smaller and smaller and easier to manage, to Eric's point.
gotcha. Eric, Jake, would you guys add anything around metrics that might best reflect efficiency gains and risk reduction? I think Matt started heading in that direction anyhow, so.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I mean, I totally agree with focusing on the new user provisioning, and I was gonna say SLAs for new users, but also terminations. Having a more consistent process and being able to track whether you're removing access within 1 business day or 2 business days or whatever your company's policy is. Outside of that too, and Matt, I think you touched on this as well. Just tracking the amount of tickets that come into IT asking for additional levels of access, or I kind of like to refer to this as just a shadow process. If before you implement the solutions and tools we're speaking to, you're getting frequent tickets asking for access, it's one-off things, and then you end up having multiple people on your team with same job title but different varying levels of access. Hopefully that should be going away once what we're talking about is implemented.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Eric?
I think that we're close to the end, and I'd prefer to
Yeah.
hear from the audience, quite
Yeah,
frankly.
good. Perfect. Yeah, so we're about to head into Q&A and I only have a couple of minutes for it. One thing I want to just call out is, as I said earlier, RedHelm can help you with defining roles for your employees, helping you with automation, and absolutely can help you with gap assessments around compliance frameworks, as well as getting certifications as we partner with Schneider Downs. At this point, I do want to open it up for Q&A. I don't know, John, if we've got a couple of questions that are queued up for us. I think that a few of us are willing to stay over time because I know we're kind of gone into Q&A already. So, and John, are there any questions that you maybe put in the chat for me? Or if the audience has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll address them as they come in. I don't know if we may not have any questions. Apparently, we did this perfectly. Okay. Well, I might, let me see. Obviously, I kind of prepared this. I might just open it to Eric and Jacob. Jake, what kind of questions have you guys typically heard from clients when they're exploring automation around HR-driven provisioning and RBAC?
I hate to say it, Chris, they want to know how it's going to reduce their fees.
Yeah, of course. What do you how do you normally respond?
Well, I think I go back to how I would normally respond there is long term, I don't know how it's going to reduce the fees until we get into it. If it's not set up right, it actually, in my opinion, increases fees because if we've got to run down a lot of SOD issues and inappropriate access, that creates hours, and that's how auditors bill, is they bill by the hour. So um, you know, but if it's set up right, there's certainly, there's a number of controls depending on which framework you're looking at that become easier to audit. And an automated control is a heck of a lot easier to audit and less time than a manual control.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, we are at the end of time. We are going to go ahead and wrap up here. And please feel free to reach out to your account managers if you work with RedHelm, or allow us to reach out to you to explore how we could partner with you to do any number of services, as well as advisory services specific to this webinar. We appreciate everyone's time, and thanks a lot.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks,
Have a great
everyone.
day.